My name is Angie Paul. I am the Women's Studies librarian. So thank you for joining me for this fourth session. So Dr. Okafor, thank you for popping back in. I was wondering if you had anything else to say before we let our first group start.
No, just a thank you for chairing this session. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Our first presentation is called Intersectionality at Work, with Katrina Brown, Kristen Conley, Rakia Menenfield, Tahisha Ortiz, and Bodisha Robertson from Women's Ethnicity and Intersectional Studies Senior Class.
My name is Rakia Williams. I identify as a cis Black woman of color. I'm a senior undergraduate at WSU University, and I'm majoring in women's studies. Intersectionality for me means being seen in a world that sees Black women as less than. It also means helping others see how people from different backgrounds encounter and experience the world.
My name is Kristen Conley. I am a graduate student in the sociology department. And intersectionality to me means that it is helping us consider the unique struggles of people who are different from us.
My name is Katrina Brown. I identify as a white cisgender woman who is LGBTQ. Intersectionality to me is an avenue that helps me understand those around me, both in my life and my career, by looking at the different things they experience based on different identities and how that might affect us.
My name is Bawada Sia. I identify as a white, non-binary bisexual. I'm a senior in the Women's Studies program, and to me, intersectionality is how everyone's going to experience the world, what they're going to face, and it also sets goals for equity that we should all aim for.
My name is Tahisha. I'm a senior undergraduate student, dual majoring in psychology and women's studies. I identify as a Latinx, cisgender woman of color. For me, intersectionality means recognizing and confronting our privileges in society while being aware of the discrimination that different marginalized people face.
Before we can address intersectionality at WSU, we must first ask what intersectionality is. So what is intersectionality?
Kimberly Crenshaw first coined the term intersectionality in an attempt to make feminism, anti-racist activism, and anti-discrimination law do what she thought they should: highlight the multiple avenues through which racial and gender oppression were experienced so that problems would be easier to discuss and understand. Intersectionality is an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege.
How can we take the concept of intersectionality and apply it to feminism? Intersectional feminism centers the voices of those experiencing overlapping, concurrent forms of oppression in order to understand the depths of the inequalities and the relationships among them in any given context.
Wichita State University is a campus that promotes inclusivity and a fair representation of a diverse society so that Wichita State community feels safe, respected, and seen. Wichita State University has a strong commitment to diversity as a core institutional and educational value. They claim that they want the faculty, staff, and student body to mirror the variety of types of people found in society. Wichita State has prioritized intersectionality and developed the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan to try and make the necessary changes on campus that will lead to what they call building a culture that values transparency, accountability, and communication around issues of diversity and inclusion. What does this look like on campus? We wanted to find out if Wichita State follows through on their commitment to diversity and intersectionality.
To do this, we interviewed 7 students to see what their experiences on campus were like relating to intersectionality. We conducted interviews using a convenient sample on campus, and we sent each participant a Google Doc to complete each question. These are the questions that we asked each participant. We asked, how do you identify in terms of gender, race, sexuality, and ethnicity? What does intersectionality mean to you? Overall, how positive or negative is your experience with intersectionality at WSU? Have you ever experienced prejudice or discrimination at WSU based on how you identify? Do you think WSU would benefit from having either an online training course or required class over intersectionality? And what changes would you like to see, if any, at WSU regarding diversity and intersectionality?
Our first interviewee has had an overall positive experience with intersectionality at WSU and does believe that a training or some kind of course on intersectionality should be required. She would like to see more gender-neutral bathrooms, gender-neutral language used by faculty and staff, more advertisements for LGBTQ support, and highlights for minorities. Overall, she was pleased with the consistency from professors regarding pronouns and preferred names. Our second interviewee has had an overall negative experience at WSU, and they have experienced discrimination. They don't believe that a training course would be enough to create the necessary change on campus, but they would like to see active consequences for staff and students regarding discriminatory behavior. They feel as though WSU continuously sides with faculty on intersectional issues and minimizes them. To them, WSU has become a campus that they're disappointed to call their own. This interviewee has had a more negative than positive experience with intersectionality at WSU and has experienced prejudice. She stated that people like to embellish terms or ideas just because she is there, but does believe that WSU would benefit from some kind of course or training on intersectionality. She would also like to see more understanding from professors because they are too focused on the bigger picture instead of the individual. This interviewee has had an overall positive experience at WSU, has never experienced prejudice or discrimination, and believes that an intersectionality course should probably be offered because to him it sounded important and he doesn't believe enough people know the term.
Next interview, I spoke with a multiracial cis woman, and for her, intersectionality for her was the understanding that we can exist as more than one thing in more than one way. Overall, she's had a really absolute positive experience at WSU in regard to intersectionality and her stay at WSU. When I did ask what changes she would like to see, if any, at WSU, she stated WSU is incredible at embracing their community. She was able to see two trailblazing efforts during her time there at WSU, such as the We Support You campaign for Suspenders for Hope, as well as the start of the Muslim Interest Delta chapter of Mu Delta Alpha sorority.
Our sixth interviewee identifies as a bisexual Middle Eastern woman. She has had a positive experience with intersectionality at WSU and believes that the university is doing well to make sure that all groups are represented on campus as well as feeling included. She says she hasn't been discriminated against even once since she has been at Wichita State and feels much more included here than she did when she was in high school. She believes that Wichita State does not need to make many other changes besides the addition of an online training course, which she believes would be incredibly beneficial.
The seventh interviewee identified as a cisgender, heterosexual, African-American male. He said his experience with intersectionality at WSU has been fairly negative, expressing that WSU does not address problems experienced by marginalized groups to help them succeed in their studies beyond graduation. He mentioned that he has experienced discrimination many times and recalls a time in which he felt uncomfortable because a professor assumed certain aspects about his identity. He believed that everyone would benefit from having a required class about intersectionality for a grade because he believed a training course oftentimes can be taken lightly and you won't learn the concepts that are required. He explained that he would like to see WSU put forth more effort in supporting marginalized and underrepresented students by ensuring their needs are met, either mentally, socially, or financially.
Observations. While the white male might be blinded by how intersectionality affects them, when something doesn't directly affect you, it becomes obsolete. Cisgender white men, for example, are not as aware of intersectionality because it does not directly affect them, and they benefit the most from the impressions that minorities face. Others on campus understand intersectionality, but have not heard the term or have only heard it in passing. It's a commonly used phrase in the women's studies classes, ethnic studies classes, etc., but not as common as other courses that do not align with these majors and ideas. We gathered from the interviews that Wichita State is somewhat following through on their commitment to diversity and intersectionality. We can see through their responses that even though there are many things the university is doing well, there are also many ways that the university can improve.
So we're going to take a look at some resources. One of the organizations that WSU has created was called Cut Hate. Cut Hate strives for a diverse and inclusive environment for all. It was created so members of the WSU community would have a safe place to report incidents of bias and that they witness or experience themselves. It's as simple as clicking on a link in the bio to file a confidential report to make everyone feel comfortable. Another thing that WSU has created was called the Suspenders for Hope campaign. This campaign was created to help people support and understand different people and be able to support one another inside of WSU and outside of WSU. It launched in 2018. It has over 800 people being trained and participating. It challenges the conversation around mental health and involves not just the WSU student body, but the community that we also do live in. I myself was able to participate that from it partner with Ascension Via Christi. So it's a big campaign that involved everyone in the community around us. Next, we'll look at the suggestions and recommendations that we do have that could possibly help this conversation be a really big deal. So the first one is requiring students and professors to take training courses that include diversity content in the concept of intersectionality. The next recommendation is fostering a better learning environment for students from an intersectionality perspective, which in turn creates a better outcome for students and sets them up for success. The last suggestion that we thought about would be including that more campus groups and events, include more campus groups and events that interlink WSU's vision for diversity and intersectionality within the Wichita community.
Here are our closing statements. We believe that intersectionality and intersectional feminism have provided a much needed perspective on the lives of those that have been immensely systemically oppressed, especially through previous theories of feminism. Through interviewing students at WSU, we are able to better visualize the experiences of people with unique intersectional frameworks by highlighting their own privileges and oppressions. As a group, we believe that WSU would benefit substantially through the implementation of required training courses regarding intersectionality and the way it impacts each of our daily lives uniquely. We're now open to questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We'll actually wait for questions until after everybody's through with their presentations.
The title of my talk is Liberal Islamophobia and Feminism at WSU. And, and we start this story with an announcement in December 2014 where Wichita State announced that it was going to host a reception for one of the activists in the film Honor Diaries, a film that would be screened locally at the Crown Uptown Theaters. Honor Diaries, which was produced in 2013, was the first film to break the silence about violence against women in honor-based societies. Restriction of movement, lack of access to education, female genital mutilation, forced and child marriage, and honor violence are some of the abuses the documentary explores in depth. It features stories from the Muslim world and the West, told by 9 women's rights activists, and has enjoyed more than 200 screenings worldwide. The documentary is available on Netflix and DirecTV. The screening is sponsored by Wichita State's School of Social Work and Criminal Justice Program. Now, there were a few details that were left out. And this is sort of background information, but I think it's important. So, who produced the film? The film was produced by an organization called the Clarion Foundation. It was founded by a man named Raphael Shore, who's a Canadian-Israeli, a film writer. He identifies himself as a film writer and entrepreneur, and he is the brother of a man named Ephraim Shore, who was the former head of organization called Honest Reporting, a pro-Israel advocacy group. And Shore was a member of an organization called Aish HaTorah, which means Fire of the Torah, that was established in Jerusalem in 1974. That organization is politically conservative, and its officials have stated that they oppose a full handover of the West Bank to the Palestinians in any kind of peace deal. What you see is that this is not a feminist organization. The organization itself is, I'll read what they say is their mission. It's to counter the threat of extremism. And how do they do that? They made a series of films. One was called Obsession: Radical Islam's War Against the West. And it's billed on their website as about the threat of radical Islam to Western civilization. That was in 2006, I believe. Then they made a film, The Third Jihad, Radical Islam's Vision for America, in 2008. They made a film, Iranium, which is about the threat of Iran, in 2011. And they made Honor Diaries in 2013, and they have gone on to make other films as well. The Clarion Project is part of a network of organizations that in many ways used Barack Obama's candidacy for president in 2008 as an opening to move ideas that were up until that point really marginal or seen as fringe into the mainstream of the Republican Party. And that's because there was the conservative movement. There were segments of it that where Barack Obama just running for president symbolized a new chapter in sort of societal evolutions in the US. And anybody who watched that campaign knew that there were questions about Obama's faith and his beliefs that came up. And it's that moment when the Clarion Project and a number of organizations that actually compose a network of sometimes overlapping, sometimes distinctive bodies start to get more airtime on Fox News, Washington Times. And in 2011, this, what is now called the Islamophobia industry, is documented in this investigative report that was put out by the Center for American Progress, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. And the report is called Fear, Inc. And they sort of look at these organizations and they look at who's funding them. The Clarion Project distributed that film Obsession to more than 28 million voters in swing states before the 2008 presidential election. There were $17 million that was given to the Clarion Project. They refused to say who gave it, but that went out to people in swing states before the election. And then one of the things that happened is an Islamic civil rights organization, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, asked the FEC to investigate the DVD distribution. And they cited the New York Secretary of State records showing that 3 people who incorporated what was called then the Clarion Fund also are employees or have been employees of Aisha Torah, which is a Jerusalem-based Jewish educational organization. It has some offices around the world. And evidence of sort of the organization having a pro-McCain bias was that there was a story in a newspaper in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which reported that the Clarion Fund website ran a pro-McCain article before it attracted notice and they took it down. And, under federal law and the tax code, nonprofit groups are restricted from getting involved in candidate races, and foreign nationals are not supposed to contribute to American campaigns. Now, the DVD's distributors say what they were doing was just issue-based. They didn't break any election laws, and they weren't found guilty of having done that. I don't even know if there was an investigation done, but what you start to see is the Muslim civil rights organizations coming forward and recognizing that these kinds of Islamophobic organizations are they're moving into the mainstream, but they're also starting to make waves in the Republican Party. Actors in the film Obsession is a woman named Bridget Gabriel, and she's the director of an organization called Act for America. And Act for America is part of the same network of organizations that are documented by this report called Fear, Inc. It is also listed as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It was a local chapter of Act for America that was listed as the contact for a local private screening. It wasn't a public screening of the film Honor Diaries, and it was at the Crown Uptown Theater in Wichita. Who owned the Crown Uptown Theater then in 2011? Well, it was taken over in 2011, and one of the owners, Lisa Ritchie, who's married to Scott Ritchie, and he's in the oil and gas business locally. Lisa Ritchie was a spokesperson for the local chapter of Act for America. And she scheduled a series of private, unpublicized events at the theater. And all these events were concerned with homegrown violence and extremism. And we know there's some leaked emails that we know that, for example, the reason these events were private was that Ritchie thought that they might be under threat if they hosted the kinds of events they wanted to host, including with some very well-known Islamophobes, a former FBI agent who was let go by the FBI for misconduct. Anyhow, we know that she contacted the FBI, and the FBI, you can see it in their emails, they're like, there's no threat. But this is part of what I would think of as kind of like the alt-right, the sort of conspiratorial thinking that they want to hold events on homegrown violence and extremism, but they see themselves as in the minority, in a kind of minority position in terms of politics, and so therefore they need protection. Lisa Ritchie reappears in October 2015. And she reappears in relationship to WSU again, which is, if some of you remember the chapel controversy that happened on campus over remaking the chapel into an interfaith space. And what happened there was a WSU a donor, local person, Jean Kuzik, who got wind of the changes and posted, "The Muslims are ecstatic." Then that gets picked up by right-wing media and it gets blasted through the airwaves. And this is the moment then when President Bardo, who was president at the time, was saying, we should have been more careful about how we communicated this. The local paper, Wichita Eagle, starts covering it. But Lisa Ritchie reappears as one of the people who is standing up against this transformation of the chapel. And she stands up and represents Act for America. And she denounced these changes. She says, "I'm here to stand up for Jesus Christ. I wouldn't feel comfortable going into a synagogue to pray or a temple or a mosque, but it's the way of the world now that we've lumped religion into interfaith." So you're starting to get a sense, I hope, about how this film even got to Wichita. So one of the things I'm developing in this chapter is this idea that feminism becomes a key weapon in moving sort of these marginal conspiratorial attitudes about Muslims taking over America, which is what these people believe, a kind of stealth Islam, moving that into the mainstream. And what happens is that I think Islamic organizations take up what I would call non-intersectional feminism as at a particular moment in which it's no longer central to a field like women's studies. That's why, and I'm not entirely sure how we, WSU and the social work department and criminal justice got connected to it, but I do think that this notion of feminism, where you have the notion that Dr. Okafor talked about in the other session, where you have this idea that women are a single group and men are a single group, and they're men oppress women in this kind of singular way, that notion is no longer essential. And so other departments become the way in for stuff about Muslim women. I looked to see what campuses hosted this film. A number of universities did, and many of the hosting or sponsoring departments We're not women's studies. So that's a very curious kind of phenomena, I think. And I think it's because by the time the film is being marketed to universities, that somehow people have figured out, I don't even think it's conscious, that women's studies isn't perhaps the logical party to ally with in bringing the film. So, and the Clarion Project itself, the organization, uses this kind of feminism to rebrand itself. This is why I'm thinking about this, because when it circulated that film, Obsession, there were all kinds of criticisms of it, saying it was not just Islamophobic, but it was sheer propaganda. And initially, the organization focused on law enforcement after 9/11 to sort of try to train police around the quote unquote Islamic threat. But by this time, by 2013, it's moving more towards targeting civil society and particularly the campus, the university campus. Shore himself, who's the head of the Clarion Project, had previously made a film about pro-Palestinian activism on campus, claiming that U.S. campuses were being taken over by anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli activists. So this is also getting into the mix in certain ways. But the point I'm trying to make here is that feminism gets picked up and used for other sorts of agendas that have very little to do with feminism. How did WSU get hooked up with this film? How did it get connected to organizations that were at that time known to be Islamophobic, known to be hate groups? And I think it's because of this is my notion about liberal Islamophobia, that liberal Islamophobia is not founded on hate. It's not hate driven. It's rather the readiness to believe generalizations about Muslims that we wouldn't about other racialized groups. And I think another characteristic of this is it authorizes right-wing Muslim women to represent all Muslim women. It lends credibility to a kind of racism on feminist ground. And evidence of that is the pushback to Honor Diaries. There were many Muslim women, and CARE spoke out against it, felt it was Islamophobic. The pushback is received as, well, you're a sexist, and your feminism is then suspect because, well, you're defending this. It's like, are you saying female genital mutilation is okay? This is the kind of pushback. So it's weaponizing this kind of non-intersectional feminism. I would just say that it's assuming also that Muslim women are a unity, that they all have the same politics. This film was contested within Muslim organizations. And I guess what I would say is, just to sum up, that this is, I think by talking about this, I've made a case for intersectional feminism, because without the perspective of without going and looking and investigating and seeing like who's producing this film, where is it from, you would just look at this film and say, oh, this is a really great film about the abuse of Muslim women.
Thank you. That was very interesting. We have a video called Why Gender Equality is Good for Everyone, Men Included, which tells the story of Dr. Michael Scott Kimmel's personal story of intersectionality. So I'm going to share my screen.
What we've found is something really important, that gender equality is in the interest of countries, of companies, and of men, and their children, and their partners. That gender equality is not a zero-sum game, it's not a win-lose, it is a win-win for everyone. And what we also know is we cannot fully empower women and girls unless we engage boys and men. We know this. And my position is that men need the very things that women have identified that they need to live the lives they say they want to live in order to live the lives that we say we want to live. In 1915, on the eve of one of the great suffrage demonstrations down Fifth Avenue in New York City, a writer in New York wrote an article in a magazine. And the title of the article was Feminism for Men. And this was the first line of that article. Feminism will make it possible for the first time for men to be free. Thank you.
That was a really entertaining video. Thank you for having us view that, Dr. Okafor. So we can wrap things up. Dr. Okafor, what would you like to say about tonight's event?
The presentations are awesome. I really, really enjoyed both of them. I will make an announcement about the evening's International Women's Day keynote, which will start by 7 o'clock and end by 8:30. We don't have too much time, but I imagine that some people might want to say something about the presentations. I really enjoyed them.
They were awesome. All of them were awesome today. Thank you.
I think that Dr. Gordon's presentation, she made a very important point about what we consume from the media or from social media and the power behind it, because that is actually the point. The routes, this person is this person's friend and this person is this person's cousin. So it can just be a group of people bringing something and using it to influence the communities and the populations. Dr. Gordon, thank you for that. And the other group, I don't want to praise you too much because I have praised you before during my preview of your presentation. It's much better than the last time.
I do have one question for the group. Your presentation was really wonderful, and I really appreciated the detailed questioning. Currently, faculty are going through, I don't remember exactly the deadline. I finished mine before the semester, a multi-part DEI video webinar that we're supposed to do. And one of the things that I noticed when I took this is it deals a lot with diversity, but very little with intersectionality. And I was wondering if I know that a lot of your focus was on students and staff taking these classes, but if you had any general sense of recommendations of what students would like to see faculty do more of or maybe be aware of. I mean, I think the fact that I can think of some faculty that need to know what intersectionality is before going forward, but is there anything that you could kind of get from the information that you drew that might guide faculty or additional kind of future surveys that we're going to be taking? Not that I have any control over the matter of the surveys at all.
One of the recommendations that we had, or like one of our suggestions and recommendations, was professors trying to foster a better learning environment in their classrooms from an intersectional perspective. And that was kind of why we suggested doing a training that focuses a lot on intersectionality specifically, was because as we know, there's a lot of professors that don't know that term. And so we were kind of wanting to use that training to help the professors find a way to implement that in their classroom to be more understanding of students. And I think there was one of our interviewees said that they had wished that professors were better at using preferred names and preferred pronouns. And so that's one of the other things that we were kind of hoping to see.
And I may suggest that if or when we have such training, we could bring in students as trainers too, because students tend to also know a lot. The students can come in as trainers to tell us what we're not doing right.
Yeah, I feel like that's what we were trying to get at with having these interviews from students, is to see where the faculty and staff are missing out and where we feel needs to be fixed. Personally, one of the people I interviewed definitely said that they feel with training courses, you learn a lot, but you don't learn enough because there's no test that's being done. You're not being tested on the information within that training course. You're just being told it and then you walk away from it. He said that he would prefer like there to be a class, no matter what degree you're getting, that you should have to learn about intersectionality because it's something that you're going to be dealing with for the rest of your life, no matter what career you're in.
Another interviewee also like expressed her concerns that if it were just like a little course, that some people would just kind of blaze through it without really paying attention to it or absorbing it. So she thought that a course would actually be better because then it would make sure that make sure that people paid attention and were absorbing the information.
For years, I have been banging away at this thing about WSU not having a diversity requirement for graduation. It never goes anywhere, but okay. So, and I think that's because a course is different. And Robin was bringing up, you know, HR has a very particular role. And that's different than sort of HR's role is basically to keep the university from getting sued. That's one of its primary purposes. And that's one kind of agenda, but that's not that doesn't necessarily change the culture of an institution. That's why you don't see much in that training. It's because legally, right, this is how intersectionality starts. There's gender discrimination and there's race discrimination. And the article that Dr. Okafor cited by Kimberly Crenshaw in her presentation is all about the fact that an African-American woman could not sue the company based on race and gender discrimination. She fell through the cracks because there were white women who worked for the company she worked for and there were black men. So I think it's not surprising then that these things, that kind of stuff you wouldn't see coming out of HR. There's lots of research also that shows that those kind of workshops don't make any difference.
I don't think I've ever gone to a Title IX or gender discrimination or any discriminatory presentation in which we have actually gotten through all of the slides, because it stops with very basic conversation of why do we need this? And that's where we sit for an hour and a half. I love the idea of getting students more involved, though I don't want to like draw out my sectional students and say, all right, tell us what life is like for you on campus. I think the anonymity of this survey was so revelatory because we didn't have to like call out our students or ask them to tell us on the spot the circumstances that they're experiencing on campus. But I really appreciated this particular presentation. Y'all are doing great work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our participants today. I think we're losing a few people, so it's probably time to say goodbye to everybody, but we'll see you tonight. I think it's at 7 o'clock.
Yes.